Life Stories brings you another inspiring tale of courage and compassion. What starts as an ordinary subway ride for Mark Strong turns into an extraordinary moment that changes lives. When faced with injustice, Mark's decision to stand up sparks a movement that reminds us all of the power of one simple act of bravery. This story isn't just about a hero, it's about how each of us can make a difference. Stay tuned to see how Mark's actions transformed not only one woman's life but an entire community. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey of inspiration and change. Mark Strong had always been a man of contrasts. To the world, he was a symbol of strength, charisma, and poise, a movie star whose roles brought characters of resilience and heroism to life. But behind the camera, Mark was a man who sought the quiet things in life. The kind of man who appreciated solitude, who valued moments where he could shed the weight of fame and just be himself. That evening in Los Angeles, after hours spent under glaring lights and the unrelenting scrutiny of the camera, Mark felt a familiar ache, not just in his muscles but deep in his spirit. It wasn't exhaustion from the demanding stunts or the endless rehearsals. It was the mental weight of always being Mark Strong, the actor. He longed for simplicity, a return to something real, something unpolished. As the driver pulled up outside his trailer, Mark had a sudden thought. He could have easily sunk into the plush leather seats of his chauffeured car, allowing it to whisk him away to the quiet refuge of his Malibu home. But that night, he craved something different. He slipped on a baseball cap, pulled it low over his brow, and donned a pair of sunglasses. It was a modest disguise, but one that made him feel invisible, ordinary. He wasn't going to retreat to his usual comforts. Instead, he decided to take the subway, a simple act that felt like rebellion against the layers of artifice that defined his daily life. Descending the stairs into the heart of the city's subway system, Mark breathed deeply. The air was damp, tinged with the metallic tang of steel tracks and the faint aroma of food wafting from a nearby vendor. This was a place where lives intersected briefly, strangers brushing past one another, each carrying their own stories. To Mark, it felt refreshingly genuine. He bought a ticket from the automated machine, his fingers lingering for a moment as he navigated the unfamiliar screen. No one seemed to notice him, and that was exactly what he wanted. He tucked his hands into his jacket pockets and moved toward the platform, leaning casually against a concrete pillar as he waited. The energy of the subway was raw and vibrant. Commuters of all kinds milled about, tired workers clutching briefcases, teenagers with headphones bobbing their heads to music only they could hear, and elderly passengers sitting quietly on benches, their faces etched with stories of decades past. Mark observed it all, his actor's mind quietly cataloguing the scene, his heart unexpectedly soothed by the rhythm of ordinary life. The train screeched into the station, its wheels grinding against the rails in a sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Mark boarded with the crowd, choosing to stand near a metal pole rather than sit. He gripped the cold steel, feeling the rattle of the train beneath his fingers as it jerked forward. For the first time in months, he felt invisible. Nobody turned to look at him, no one whispered his name. People were too absorbed in their phones or their conversations. It was a relief, and Mark allowed himself a small smile. It was comforting, even liberating, to simply be part of the crowd. As the train sped through the city, Mark's gaze wandered. His eyes fell on an elderly woman who entered at the next stop. She was small, her back slightly hunched as she leaned heavily on a wooden cane. Her beige coat was plain but clean, and she clutched a well-worn leather purse against her chest. Her every step was deliberate, slow, a testament to both her fragility and her determination. Mark's heart ached slightly as he watched her. She looked around for a seat, but none of the passengers moved. Those who sat avoided her gaze, their faces glued to their phones or turned toward the window. The indifference in the air was almost palpable. Mark wanted to act, to offer her his spot. But before he could, the woman found a seat. She lowered herself into it with visible effort. her face briefly contorting in pain before she let out a soft sigh. Resting her cane across her lap, she sat quietly, her hands gripping her purse like a lifeline. Mark shifted uncomfortably. He had seen moments like this before, moments when people turned away instead of helping. Moments of small injustices that too often went unnoticed. It was a quiet reminder of how easily people could lose sight of each other's humanity. The train lurched forward again. And for a time, all was calm. Mark closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the subway carry him away. But peace on the subway was often fleeting. At the next stop, a young man entered. He wore a black hoodie, its edges pulled low to obscure his face, and moved with an energy that instantly drew Mark's attention. The man's gaze flicked around the car. Sharp and predatory. Mark recognized it immediately, a kind of restless intent he had seen countless times before, both in life and in the roles he played. The young man approached the elderly woman, his movements deliberate and focused. "Hey, old lady," the man sneered, his voice low but cutting through the muted hum of the train. "That bag looks heavy. Why don't you let me hold it for you?" The elderly woman looked up, her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "I don't need help, young man," she replied, her voice trembling but firm. "Please leave me be." Mark's jaw tightened as he watched the interaction. He could feel the tension building, the unspoken question in the air: would anyone step up? The passengers around them shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their heads further, others pretending not to hear. The man leaned closer, his voice dropping but growing more menacing. "I said, give me the bag. Don't make me ask twice." The woman clutched her purse tighter, pulling it against her chest. Her hands trembled, but her resolve was clear. Mark's fingers tightened around the pole he was holding. He glanced around the car one last time, hoping someone else might intervene, but it was clear no one would. It was in that moment, that space between hesitation and action, that Mark made his choice. He couldn't stand by. Not this time. He let go of the pole, slid his sunglasses into his jacket pocket, and stepped forward. "Hey," he said, his voice calm but commanding. The single word cut through the car like a knife, drawing every eye toward him. The young man froze, turning to face Mark. For a moment, he seemed to size him up, trying to decide if Mark was a threat or just another bystander pretending to be brave. "Mind your business, old man," the young man barked, stepping closer to Mark, his confidence swelling. Mark tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low but sharp with authority. "Walk away." The man hesitated for a split second, and in that brief pause, Mark's calm exterior concealed a storm of readiness. He had been in situations far worse than this, and he wasn't about to back down. The young man's hesitation was fleeting. His face twisted into a smug grin, and his posture shifted. Shoulders squared, fists clenched. He leaned closer to Mark, his voice rising enough to challenge the silence of the subway car. "You think you're a tough guy? Huh?" Trying to play hero, he sneered, his confidence bolstered by the lack of intervention from the surrounding passengers. Mark didn't flinch, his gaze locked on the young man's, steady and sharp. "This isn't a game," he replied calmly. "You've got one chance to walk away. Don't waste it." The tension in the subway car was palpable. Every eye was on them now, the usual hum of idle chatter replaced by an eerie silence. The other passengers remained frozen in their seats, torn between fear and curiosity. Phones were slowly raised to record the scene, but no one dared to speak or move. The young man's grin faltered, just for a moment, before it turned into a snarl. He lunged forward, swinging wildly at Mark. The movement was fast, but not fast enough. Mark sidestepped the blow with a precision born from years of physical training and life experience. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it just enough to send him stumbling backward into an empty seat. Gasps rippled through the car as the onlookers watched in stunned silence. For a brief moment, it seemed the confrontation might end there. But the young man wasn't finished. Furious and humiliated, he shot back to his feet, his movements now erratic and desperate. "Stay down," Mark said, his voice firm but not raised. It wasn't a command born of arrogance, but of experience. He knew that pushing the young man further could escalate the situation in ways that might endanger everyone. The young man, however, wasn't listening. His eyes darted left and right, searching for a way to reclaim control. Then, in a sudden burst of motion, he reached into his jacket pocket. Mark's instincts kicked in, his muscles tensing as he braced for the worst. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if the young man had a weapon. The young man pulled out a small red canister. It wasn't a knife or a gun, but a can of pepper spray. Before Mark or anyone else could react, the young man pressed the nozzle and sprayed it directly into Mark's face. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. Mark stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face as the stinging liquid burned his eyes and skin. It felt like fire spreading across his face, blinding him and making it almost impossible to breathe. A chorus of gasps and shouts erupted from the passengers as they recoiled from the spray's lingering mist. "Yeah. How tough are you now, old man?" the young man taunted, his voice triumphant. He waved the canister in the air like a trophy, his earlier fear replaced by smugness. "Bet you didn't see that coming." "Huh." Mark's knees buckled under the intensity of the pain, but he refused to fall. His breaths came in slow, deliberate gulps as he fought against the searing agony. Somewhere in the haze of pain and noise, he heard the young man's laughter and the murmurs of the crowd. But there was something deeper within Mark, a resolve that had been forged over years of challenges, both personal and professional. Pain was temporary, he reminded himself. It could be endured, even overcome, with the right mindset. He forced his eyes to open, blinking furiously against the burning sensation. His vision was blurry, colors and shapes blending together in a chaotic swirl. But he could make out enough: the platform outside the subway car, the figures of passengers frozen in shock, and the young man moving toward the doors as the train slowed to its next stop. The young man muttered something under his breath, his tone smug and dismissive. "Next stop. I'm out," he said, stepping toward the subway doors. Mark straightened slightly, wiping at his face with his jacket sleeve. The rough fabric scraped against his raw skin. But he didn't care. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting. But so was his determination. This wasn't over. Through his blurred vision, he focused on the young man, who was now stepping off the train and onto the crowded platform. The predator thought he'd won. He thought he'd escaped. Mark's breath steadied, his chest rising and falling with purpose. He could feel the weight of the passengers' stares on him, their unspoken hope that he wouldn't give up. Slowly, he took a step forward, and then another. The pain in his eyes was almost overwhelming, but it didn't stop him. The young man turned to glance over his shoulder, likely to ensure his victory was complete. When his eyes met Mark's, his expression shifted from smugness to disbelief. He froze for a fraction of a second, as though his brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Mark was still coming. His pace wasn't hurried or frantic, it was steady, deliberate. Each step echoed like a drumbeat on the platform, a sound that seemed to grow louder in the young man's ears. The predator had become the prey. The young man's face twisted into a mask of panic. His earlier bravado crumbled as he turned and pushed his way through the crowd, his movements clumsy and desperate. But Mark didn't falter. He followed, his body moving on instinct, his focus locked on one simple goal: to stop him. The platform seemed to hold its breath as the chase unfolded. The passengers who had once been passive observers were now captivated, their phones capturing every second of Mark's relentless pursuit. For the first time in a long time, they weren't just watching a man, they were watching a force of will. as the young man bolted toward a set of stairs leading out of the subway station. Mark quickened his pace. His heart pounded not with fear, but with purpose. He knew this wasn't just about justice. It was about something bigger. It was about showing the world and himself that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about acting despite the fear. The young man scrambled up the stairs 2 at a time, shoving past commuters who cursed at him as he went. His breaths came in short, panicked bursts, each step propelled by the fear that churned in his chest. He glanced over his shoulder once more, desperate to confirm that Mark had stopped. But when he looked back, his heart sank. Mark was still following him, his pace steady and unyielding, even through the haze of pepper spray. His eyes remained locked on the young man, his jaw set in determination. Every movement exuded a quiet, controlled power. It wasn't speed that drove Mark forward, it was resolve. "Move," the young man barked as he pushed past a woman carrying a shopping bag. The plastic tore as she stumbled, its contents spilling onto the steps. She called after him angrily, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. His one focus now was escape. Mark reached the bottom of the stairs and began his ascent. His footsteps measured but heavy, each one echoing off the concrete walls. The crowd parted instinctively, their eyes darting between the young man and the figure pursuing him. Whispers began to ripple through the commuters. "Is that Mark Strong? Wait. What's happening? Someone record this." The young man reached the top of the stairs and spotted an emergency exit to his right. It was a narrow side hallway, poorly lit, but it offered a glimmer of hope. If he could reach it, he might have a chance to lose his pursuer in the chaotic streets above. Without a second thought, he bolted for it, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. Mark saw him turn toward the hallway and quickened his pace, his muscles burning with exertion. He could feel the sting of the pepper spray still lingering in his eyes, but it was a distant sensation now, secondary to the surge of adrenaline coursing through him. The crowd at the top of the stairs watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every moment. The young man was nearly at the emergency door when he felt a powerful hand clamp down on the back of his hoodie. The force was so sudden and so firm that he was yanked backward, his feet briefly lifting off the ground. He hit the concrete floor with a hollow thud, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Gasping for air, the young man blinked up at the shadow looming over him. Mark stood there, his chest rising and falling with deep, controlled breaths. His face was streaked with tears from the pepper spray, but his gaze was unwavering. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to silence any protest. The young man scrambled to his knees, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Look, man. I didn't mean it," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know it was you. I swear." Mark tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said, his voice low and steady. "What matters is what you did." The young man flinched at the calm authority in Mark's tone. "I'll give it all back," he blurted, fumbling with his pockets and pulling out the elderly woman's purse. He held it up like a peace offering, his hands trembling. "Here. Take it. Just let me go." Mark's expression didn't change. Slowly, he reached for the emergency call button on the wall nearby. Pressing it, he spoke into the intercom with the same calm, deliberate tone. "This is Mark Strong. I've apprehended a man who assaulted a passenger and sprayed me with pepper spray. Send the police." The young man's face drained of color as the weight of Mark's words sank in. He dropped the purse to the ground, his hands clasping together in a desperate plea. "Please, man, don't do this. I've got a family. I've got people who need me." Mark's gaze didn't waver. "You should have thought about that before you tried to intimidate an old woman," he replied, his voice cutting through the young man's excuses like a blade. Moments later, the distant sound of sirens echoed through the station, growing louder with each passing second. The young man hung his head, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Around them, the crowd began to murmur again, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. When the police arrived, their boots thudding against the platform, they were greeted by a sight that would soon become the stuff of viral legend. Mark Strong stood calm and resolute, his hand resting lightly on the young man's shoulder to keep him from bolting. The young man, in stark contrast, looked utterly defeated, his eyes darting around the platform in search of an escape that no longer existed. "On your feet," one of the officers barked, pulling the young man upright and snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click seemed to echo louder than the sirens themselves. The young man offered no resistance, his earlier bravado completely shattered. One of the officers approached Mark, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "Are you all right, sir? Do you need medical attention?" "I'll be fine," Mark replied, wiping his face again with the inside of his jacket sleeve. His voice was steady, though the sting of the spray was still evident in his reddened eyes. He glanced toward the elderly woman, who was now clutching her purse tightly, tears streaming down her face. The officer followed Mark's gaze and nodded. "We'll take it from here, Mr. Strong." "Thank you." Mark nodded, stepping back as the officers led the young man away. But before they disappeared up the stairs, he locked eyes with the thief one last time. His message was clear. Though unspoken, respect isn't optional, it's a responsibility. As the station began to return to its usual rhythm, Mark turned his attention to the elderly woman. He walked toward her slowly, his steps heavy but purposeful. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with gratitude and disbelief. "You're him, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're really him." Mark knelt slightly so they were at eye level. "Yes. But that's not what matters," he said softly. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" The woman shook her head, her lips quivering as tears continued to fall. "I'm fine. Because of you," she said. Her words were simple, but the weight of her gratitude was profound. Mark placed a gentle hand over hers, his voice steady and warm. "We all have to stand up for each other," he said. "That's the only way it changes." Her eyes, filled with admiration and something deeper, hope, held his for a long moment. In that silence, a connection was made, one that would linger far beyond the subway ride. Mark left the subway that evening exhausted but resolute. The sting of the pepper spray lingered, a physical reminder of the encounter. Yet, the overwhelming feeling within him wasn't pain, it was a quiet sense of purpose. What had started as a routine ride on the subway had turned into something far greater than he could have imagined. By the time Mark reached home, the events of the day were already spreading like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation, taken by passengers on the train and platform, flooded social media. Clips of Mark confronting the young man, being sprayed, and still pursuing him were replayed over and over, accompanied by captions like "real-life hero" and "when strength meets integrity." Mark's phone buzzed incessantly. Friends, colleagues, and even reporters were reaching out, wanting to know more. He ignored most of the notifications, sitting instead in the quiet of his living room. His face was still red and sore, but as he scrolled through the countless videos and comments, he realized something important. The world wasn't just watching, they were listening. Among the endless memes and admiration, a particular sentiment stood out. People weren't only inspired by Mark's actions, they were beginning to reflect on their own behavior. Comment sections were filled with questions. What would I have done in that situation? And why do we always wait for someone else to act? For Mark, this was more significant than any applause. It wasn't about being seen as a hero, it was about sparking something deeper, a collective shift in how people approached these moments. The next day, Mark decided it was time to say something. He set up his phone in his home office, choosing a plain backdrop of bookshelves and natural light filtering through a nearby window. There were no theatrics, no rehearsed speeches, just Mark, speaking from the heart. He went live on Instagram, and within seconds, Tens of thousands of people joined. The comments flew in at lightning speed, with fans and strangers alike flooding the feed with messages of admiration. Mark took a breath, letting the noise of the comments fade into the background. Then, in the same calm but commanding tone he had used on the subway, he began. "I know a lot of you have seen the video," he said, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. "And I know some of you think what I did was heroic. But I need you to understand something, it's not about me. This isn't about fame or recognition." He paused, his gaze steady as he looked directly into the camera. "This is about her," he said, his voice softening. "The woman on that train. Ethel. She was alone. Surrounded by people. But still alone. Nobody moved. Nobody acted. And that's the part we need to talk about." The comment section slowed as viewers hung on his words. Mark leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I know it's hard. I know it's scary to step in when something's wrong. But courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. And the truth is, we've all become too comfortable looking away." He recounted the moment on the train, describing the hesitation he had seen in the passengers and the quiet desperation in Ethel's eyes. His voice grew firmer as he spoke, the weight of his conviction evident in every word. "If you see someone being harassed or hurt, don't wait for someone else to act. Be the one who steps up," he said. "You don't need to be a bodybuilder or a movie star. You just need to care." Mark let his words settle, the silence stretching for a few moments before he added, "We all have the power to make a difference. And if enough of us decide to do something, the world starts to change." The live stream ended after just 10 minutes. But its impact was immediate. Within an hour, Mark's video had been viewed over 2 million times. Clips of his speech were reposted across platforms, paired with captions like "Be the one to make it right." The phrase took on a life of its own, becoming a rallying cry for action and accountability. News outlets picked up the story, framing Mark's message as a wake-up call for society. Discussions about bystander intervention flooded social media, with people sharing their own experiences, moments they had stepped in to help someone, or moments they regretted staying silent. For Mark, this was the real victory. The confrontation on the subway had been about more than stopping one thief, it had been a catalyst for reflection and change. And while the fame of the moment didn't matter to him, the idea that his actions could inspire others did. A week later, the movement gained even more traction when city officials announced new measures to improve safety on public transport. Emergency buttons were installed on subway cars. More security patrols were deployed. And public awareness campaigns were launched with the slogan "Be the one to make it right." Mark's face appeared on posters and billboards, though he insisted on keeping the focus on the message, not himself. For every media outlet that wanted to highlight his heroism, he redirected attention to the broader issue. It wasn't about him, it was about creating a culture where people felt empowered to stand up for each other. Despite the growing attention, Mark kept his life as normal as possible. He continued to receive countless interview requests, but he turned most of them down. He wasn't interested in being a celebrity advocate, he wanted the movement to grow organically, driven by the actions of everyday people. One day, as he scrolled through the countless stories people were now sharing online, a particular post caught his eye. It was from Ethel, the woman he had helped on the subway. In her words, Mark found not only gratitude but a profound sense of hope. "You reminded me," she had written, "that people can still care, and that makes all the difference." Mark read the words twice, then closed his eyes, letting the moment wash over him. It wasn't about fame, applause, or even the movement itself. It was about people like Ethel, and the quiet but powerful ways in which courage could ripple outward. And in that moment, Mark knew he had done the right thing. The following week, Mark received a letter that stopped him in his tracks. Amid the flood of messages, emails, and news reports, this one stood out. It wasn't typed or flashy, just a simple envelope with his name written in careful, looping handwriting. The return address was a community center in Brooklyn. Inside was a short, handwritten note. Dear Mr. Strong, I wanted to thank you again for what you did. Not just for me, but for everyone who has ever felt small and overlooked. You didn't have to step in, but you did. And you reminded me of something I thought I'd forgotten, that people still care. If you ever have the time, I'd like to meet you in person. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart. With gratitude. Ethel. Mark read the letter twice, his fingers brushing over the paper as though trying to feel the depth of her words. He folded it carefully, placing it on the desk beside him. Ethel's words struck a chord, not because they were full of praise, but because they carried something far more profound, hope. He reached for his phone and dialed the number provided in the letter. After a few rings, a soft, familiar voice answered. Hello. Hi. Ethel. Mark said, his tone warm but steady. This is Mark Strong. I got your letter. Oh. My, she said, her voice trembling with surprise. I didn't think you'd actually call. I couldn't ignore it, he replied. You asked to meet. And I'd like that. Tell me when and where. The next afternoon, Mark arrived at the Southside Community Center in Brooklyn. The building was modest, its brick facade weathered but welcoming. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby basketball court, where a group of kids played an energetic game. Mark parked his truck, stepping out and taking in the scene. Ethel sat on a bench near the entrance, her wooden cane resting against her leg. She wore a deep burgundy coat, freshly pressed, and her posture held a quiet dignity. When she saw Mark, her face lit up with a smile that seemed to erase years from her features. Well, look who it is, she said, her voice filled with warmth. The man himself. Mark returned her smile as he approached. I figured if Ethel wanted to meet, I shouldn't keep her waiting. Ethel chuckled, gesturing to the bench beside her. Sit down. Sit down. No need to stand there like you're about to give a speech. Mark lowered himself onto the bench, the wooden planks creaking slightly under his weight. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the kids play basketball and the older men nearby argue over a chessboard. The world around them felt peaceful. Ordinary, a stark contrast to the chaos of the subway encounter. I wanted to see you face to face, Ethel said finally, her voice soft but deliberate. I needed to thank you properly, not just for what you did that day, but for everything you've done since. Mark glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. I just did what anyone should do, he said simply. Ethel shook her head, her gaze steady. No, you did more than that. You spoke up when others didn't. And then you kept speaking, even when it would have been easier to stay quiet. That's rare, Mark. And it's important. Her words carried a weight that Mark couldn't ignore. He nodded, letting them sink in before replying. People needed to hear it, he said. And they needed to see it. If we don't say or do something, people forget. They move on. I couldn't let that happen. Ethel smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and pride. Well, you didn't just remind people. You gave them something to believe in. And I think you know that. Mark didn't respond immediately. His gaze drifted back to the basketball court, where one boy had just made an impressive shot, drawing cheers from his friends. People think strength is about muscles or toughness, he said after a moment. But it's not. Strength is standing up when no one else will. It's taking the hits and not backing down. Ethel nodded slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the ground. You've got that kind of strength, Mark. I saw it that day. But you know what? So do I. Mark turned to her, surprised by the quiet confidence in her voice. I didn't feel strong that day, Ethel admitted. I felt small. Like the world was too big for me. But then I saw you get up. After he sprayed you. When you could barely see him. And you still went after him. That's when I realized something. Her voice grew firmer. And she pointed a finger at Mark. I realized I don't have to be afraid anymore. And neither does anyone else. Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply. Mark looked at her, his expression softening. You're right, he said quietly. No one should have to feel that way. Ethel reached out, placing a hand on Mark's arm. Her fingers were small and trembling, but her grip was steady. Can I ask you for something? She asked. Anything. Mark replied. Don't stop, she said, her gaze locking onto his. Don't stop talking about it. Don't stop telling people to stand up. Because a lot of folks are listening now. And some of them need to hear it from you. Not from the mayor or the news. From you. Mark nodded, his voice firm. I won't stop. Ethel. Not until they learn. Her face softened, her smile returning. Good, she said. Because the world needs people like you. They spent the next hour talking, their conversation weaving between stories of Ethel's late husband, her children, and the work the community center did for the neighborhood's youth. Mark listened intently, laughing at her jokes and soaking in the wisdom of her words. By the time they parted ways, a bond had been formed, one rooted in mutual respect and shared purpose. As Mark watched Ethel walk back into the community center, he felt a renewed sense of resolve. Her words echoed in his mind, don't stop. The world needs people like you. Mark smiled softly, glancing toward the basketball court where the kids were still playing. One of them noticed him, his eyes widening in recognition. Hey, that's him, the boy shouted. Be the one to make it right. The other kids joined in, waving and laughing, the phrase now a badge of honor. Mark waved back, his grin widening as he walked toward his truck. The world wasn't perfect, he thought, but it could change. And maybe, just maybe, it was starting to. With a lighter heart, he climbed into his truck and drove away, carrying Ethel's words and the weight of their meaning with him. The ripple effect of Mark's actions continued to grow, reaching corners of society that neither he nor Ethel could have imagined. The phrase "be the one to make it right" had become a mantra, plastered on posters at subway stations, quoted in social media posts, and even painted on the walls of schools. It wasn't just a slogan anymore, it was a movement. Mark, however, stayed out of the spotlight as much as he could. He didn't want the attention to focus solely on him. His goal was always the message, not the man behind it. But when the mayor's office reached out to him, Mark knew it was time to do more. A phone call with Mayor Phillips was short and to the point. The mayor explained that Mark's actions had galvanized the city into taking long overdue steps to improve public safety on the subway. They were rolling out new measures, more security personnel on trains, additional emergency call buttons, and public awareness campaigns to empower passengers to act when they saw something wrong. We need you, Mark, the mayor said over the phone. Not as an actor, but as a symbol of what it means to stand up for others. People listen to you. They believe in you. Will you help us lead this? Mark hesitated for a moment. He wasn't one for politics or public campaigns, but as he glanced at Ethel's letter, still sitting neatly folded on his desk, he remembered her words, don't stop. The world needs people like you. I'll help, he said finally, his voice resolute. But I'm not doing this for speeches or headlines. I'm doing it because it needs to be done. The next week, the city held a press conference at City Hall to announce the new initiatives. Mark stood behind the podium, flanked by the mayor and a row of city officials. The crowd outside was larger than expected, spilling into the streets, with banners and signs bearing messages of support. Cameras from every major news outlet captured the scene, their lenses trained on Mark as he prepared to speak. He took a deep breath and scanned the faces in the crowd. They weren't just strangers, they were people. Individuals who wanted to feel safe, who wanted to know they could count on each other. I'm not here to talk about movies, he began, his voice steady and calm. I'm here to talk about responsibility. The crowd quieted, hanging on his words. You've all seen the video. You've heard the stories. But this isn't about me. It's about Ethel. The woman on that subway train. It's about every person like her who rides the train every day, hoping they'll get home safely. Mark's gaze hardened, his tone growing sharper. No one should have to hope for safety. It should be guaranteed. And it's not just the city's job to ensure that, it's ours. Every single one of us has a role to play. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. We can't keep looking away. We can't keep waiting for someone else to step in. If you see something wrong, don't turn your back. Don't wait for someone else. Be the one to make it right. The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the streets. But Mark wasn't finished. Courage isn't about being fearless, he continued, his voice rising above the cheers. It's about standing up even when you're scared. It's about knowing what's right and choosing to act, no matter how hard it is. That's what I want you to take away from this. Not my name. Not my face. Just the idea that we can all do better. When Mark stepped back from the podium, the crowd surged forward, cheering and clapping with an intensity that felt like a collective exhale. The mayor shook his hand, and city officials nodded approvingly. But Mark's thoughts were elsewhere. He wasn't looking for validation. He was thinking about what Ethel had said, about the strength that lay dormant in so many people, waiting to be awakened. That evening, Mark sat in his living room, his phone buzzing with notifications. Clips of his speech had already gone viral, accompanied by headlines like "Mark Strong, from actor to advocate and be the one to make it right sparks national movement." Celebrities, athletes, and public figures were sharing his words, amplifying the message far beyond the city. But for Mark, it wasn't about the reach, it was about the impact. As he scrolled through the comments, one post caught his attention. It was from a young man who had been on the same train that day. "I was there," the post read. "I froze. I didn't do anything. But after seeing what Mark did, I know I can't let that happen again. Next time, I'll be the one to step up." Mark leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. This was why he had done it, not for fame, but for change. The city's initiatives quickly took effect. Emergency buttons were installed on every train car. More security officers were hired, and public service announcements played on a loop at subway stations. Posters bearing the slogan "Be the one to make it right" featured not just Mark's image, but photos of diverse, everyday people stepping in to help others. The campaign wasn't about idolizing Mark, it was about empowering everyone. A few days later, Mark received another message from Ethel. This time, it was a short text: "You're making them listen. Don't forget what I said. Don't stop." Mark replied simply, "I won't." As he closed his phone, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced in years. The world was far from perfect, but it was changing, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt like he wasn't just an observer, he was part of the solution. The phrase "be the one to make it right" continued to echo in schools, workplaces, and homes. It became more than just a rallying cry, it became a way of life for many. And as Mark sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of Ethel's words lingered in his mind. The world needed people like him. But more importantly, it needed people like all of them, ordinary individuals willing to act. And as long as he could inspire even one person to stand up, Mark knew he'd made a difference. In the end, Mark Strong's actions on that subway became more than a moment, they became a movement. His courage inspired thousands to stand up, speak out, and make a difference in their communities. From Ethel's heartfelt gratitude to the changes implemented across the city, Mark proved that even the smallest acts of bravery could ripple outwards, changing lives. As the world embraced the message, "Be the one to make it right," Mark felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. It wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about showing that we all have the power to create change. And somewhere, on a train or in a crowded street, someone else was now ready to stand up. thanks to the story that began with one simple act of courage. If this story inspired you, subscribe to Life Stories for more incredible tales of bravery and kindness. Together, we can make the world a better place.